Hello guys, welcome back to today's episode of the podcast. And before I get into it, I thought I would explain, because I know there's a couple new people joining the Female Genius podcast. Welcome, hello. I hope you're happy to be here because I'm happy to have you here. I thought I'd kind of explain the structure of the episodes because somebody was like, what goes on in the first 5 minutes of this podcast? Like, can you explain what is happening? And so I have this thing that I like to call my cold open, because I'm a comedic genius above everything else. And I have on my notes app on my phone, I have a list of things that happen to me and a list of things that I talk about with my friends or genuinely just think about myself. And I'm like, okay, I give myself free reign, like a 5-minute timer on this podcast to go nuts and to go talk about whatever I want. So that is a cold open before we crack on to the following episodes, just so you guys are aware. And today's cold open, guys. Okay. First of all, I just want to preface that I'm super duper happy that one of my favorite Netflix shows, I think it's like tied with Bridgerton, to be honest. One of my favorite Netflix shows, Outer Banks, is coming back October 10th, right? What I'm not happy with is this 2-part bullshit, to be frank, that Netflix keeps doing, okay? I have a vendetta against Netflix, I promise you. Now, I used to be one of those people that was like, I don't like it when Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime release everything at once. I'm not a fan of it. I'm not a fan of the idea of binge watching. I don't like binge watching. I like the idea of being excited. I miss when we used to release things once a week, and it's coming back now. Like House of Dragon Sundays. Oh my God, where you would watch one episode and it would end on a cliffhanger, and then you're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Oh my God, my heart. And then you have time to talk about it with your friends. The internet has time to discuss theories. Twitter's going crazy, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's amazing. And then on Sunday, 7 p.m., everybody is sat in front of the TV. Your friends are like live texting each other. Like, atmosphere is electric, okay, when TV shows are released once a week. Not only that, if I happen to not be free on a Sunday, 7 p.m., I then have a whole week to catch up. I have a whole week to prep myself, to allow myself to discover things, to watch it in my own pace and time, as long as I'm ready before the next week. And the spoilers I get won't be crazy. However, because they're releasing shows in bulk, right, I will get the craziest spoilers. It's like I will find out what happens in the end of the show, and I'm only on episode 2. Because even though Netflix released it an hour ago, there's some freak of nature that's watched the whole thing already, right? I started watching this K-drama called Love Next Door, and it's conceived for mind, body, and soul, guys. It's so heartwarming, but it's funny. And it has important messages and themes, and the acting is phenomenal. And it's not the kind of dramatic acting that's like, you know, like you love me. Like, you know, it's not dramatic, but it's in the tiny details. And that's how you can tell the difference between like a good actor and like an actor, like a seasoned, well-developed actor. Is in the little face intonations. This is the way they work, is the way they look, is the size, is the hand. Like, they think about everything, and it just makes the show so good. And basically, they release an episode every Saturday and Sunday. And some people would think, like, oh my God, like, it's on a cliffhanger, like, I really want to know what happens. I can't live like this. But delayed gratification is important, guys. And so now, it's almost Saturday, and I've just been excited the whole week. I'm, like, on TikTok looking at different fan edits and thinking, okay, what could be happening next? And I know Saturday, 3:30 p.m., I'm going to be turned on to that TV watching that new episode. And it's given me something to look forward to the entire week. But it also hasn't consumed my entire day. Like 1 hour, 1 episode, I can do that, and then I could go on my job hunt. I could go on and record podcast episodes, or like edit, or just do whatever, or read or research things, and still like live my life without being absolutely consumed by one TV show for an entire day. Following the first part of the series, there's only going to be 2 parts. So is it really a series? I don't know. But last week I introduced the What Makes a Genius episode, where we discussed and we talked about all of the different theories of what it is to actually be a genius by societal standards. We critiqued the IQ test. I developed my own psychological theory in the bar, Lisa Simpson theory. I promised you guys that I would come back this week to talk and extend the topic to talk about this idea of the tortured genius. Before we go into the episode, I just want to say, complete trigger warning, we are going to be talking about topics that are quite dark and people's lives that haven't ended in the most beautiful way. There is talks of depression, self-harm, suicide ideation, and actual suicide. And why I try to keep things as lighthearted and as motivating and as informative as possible, and I've tried to approach this episode in the same way. If these are topics that would trigger you, please, you can pause this now. You've heard my 5-minute rant. And please take the time to look after yourself and then come back on Sunday because I have a super fun, ridiculous, chaotic episode just for you guys so you don't feel like you're missing out your weekly dose of genius. So yeah, and also if you feel like you need any help or listening to me talking about some of these topics makes you realize that you feel like you need to reach out to someone, please do. I will leave links in the bio of this podcast episode wherever you're listening to, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please look at the bio and I can direct you towards some people that might potentially help. And without further ado, welcome geniuses to this episode of the Female Genius Podcast.
Female Genius.
Kanye West, one of the most prolific rappers, musicians, creatives of all time, we all know openly struggles with a bipolar disorder. He struggles with mental disorder, and it's no secret to anybody who listens or is aware of his music or has ever seen anything this man has ever tweeted in his life. In 2019, he tweeted, "I cannot be on meds and make Watch the Throne level or dark fantasy level music." He's basically implying that he believes that his mental health struggles are intrinsic to his talent as a musician. And if he was to deal with these mental health struggles in a way in which his doctor prescribes him to do, he will never be able to create or ascribe to the level of greatness that society has deposited on him. And there is a lot that can be said in terms of what we define a genius and what makes you genetically predisposed to be a genius. But I explored all of that in the first part of this series. So if you haven't watched that, what are you doing? If you haven't seen that episode after this one, or in fact before, because I feel like it leads on pretty well, click off, go watch that, listen to it, and then come back and listen to this one. There is this notion amongst musicians and sometimes artists who have this very intrinsic belief that trauma and suffering and the self-inflicted torture of one's mental state is very fundamental to their being and their idea and the production of their work, right? And I feel like you can see this idea of being like a tortured genius or a tortured artist is always romanticized in media, right? When you look at TV shows or movies or whatnot, you always have this idea of the guy that's going to produce the next literary masterpiece. He's in his little office in an attic, above his mom's place because he recently got divorced from his wife and he has bags underneath his eyes because he can't sleep and he has a drinking problem, and when you walk into his workspace, it stinks, it's stale because he hasn't showered in 2 weeks. There's beer bottles and wine bottles all over the place and just writing manically scrambled all over the place and scratches down the wall. Like, that is our idea of a tortured genius. But then we know at the end of the day, right, it doesn't matter how much he suffered because he is going to deliver the most beautiful piece of art. Think about the movie Whiplash, right? That explores the desire of this guy who wants to be the best jazz musician of all time, and this teacher who's breaking him down and causing him to remove things that make him happy in life because he wants to be focused on this one singular goal. One thing I find interesting about the movie Whiplash, just as a side note, is that when you watch the ending of the movie and he finally does that amazing drum solo and he does it so amazing, and his teacher is finally like, yes, like this is the level you're supposed to be. And he has a very satisfied look on his face. I felt like when I watched that scene, I didn't feel satisfied by the ending. I didn't feel like, oh my God, yes, he did it. He's so amazing. He's so cool. Kind of like, when a superhero defeats the bad guy at the end of the movie, there's a sense of satisfaction. In that movie, it kind of felt like he lost. Like, oh my God, he got what he wanted, but at what cost? The feeling I had when I watched Whiplash perfectly encapsulates this idea and this struggle and this notion that we should have towards the tortured artist, the tortured genius. Per usual, What does the science say about this? There's so much contention, and this idea that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation is very, very important. Just because there is a correlation between the number of times your cat screams and the amount of likes on Kylie Jenner's Instagram page doesn't mean that your cat screaming causes, Kylie Jenner's Instagram likes to go up. Do you see what I mean? And I think that's a very important idea and notion to keep in your heads when you're thinking about the link between mental disorders and creativity and output of creative work. Just because an artist has a mental disorder or is going through something or has gone through something really, really dark or bad, that does not necessarily mean or is not necessarily the absolute cause of their genius or the most amazing aspect of their piece of work. I think, to me, that encapsulates the idea of being able to produce art as a result of having a bad experience is being able to take something that you've gone through that's bad, that's suffering, and being able to use music or art or writing as a creative outlet, and then to deliver it out into the world to help somebody else, or to help somebody else process their emotions in a certain way. When I first did therapy, my very first therapist, I love her. Maybe I always say, is she my favorite one? I always get conflicted. Anyway, I love her so much. When I was going through the therapy, I was like, I don't know how to express like the emotions I want to say. Like, I generally do not know how to process this. I've been trying to process this event for the past 3, 4, 5 years of my life, and I still don't know what to do. Like, everything anybody's telling me, I just don't know what to do. And she was like, okay, why don't you tell me how you feel in songs? Because you love music, you're a musician, you love creating music, you're part of a band. Like, maybe that is your way of processing this thing and this feeling, right? And so I did. And in my personal opinion, I wrote some of the most beautiful songs I've ever written in my life, because I used that to process everything I felt, every negative emotion I felt towards it, every positive emotion I felt to everybody related to the situation. And it was the most healthy way to close a certain chapter of my life that I was struggling to close for so long, right? But I could only do that as a process of processing and having therapy and talking to somebody and having correct mechanisms of getting help. I could only do that in the most healthy and beautiful way possible, because I got the help I needed for my mental health. There's a great divide in cognitive neuroscience community on whether there is actually genuinely a scientific link between being creative and mental illnesses, right? And the general consensus I get, again, there is a divide. So some people feel like there is a link, or there is examples of a link, and that can be seen in certain disorders such as schizophrenia. So people that suffer schizophrenia, I talked about it a little bit in the last episode, in terms of their dopamine receptors and the way that is structured and the density of that in their brain. So if you want to learn more about that, last episode. In the US, for example, 1 in 4 people annually has a mental illness that impairs their function. So the idea that a creative ill person suffers from a mental illness isn't statistically like a wild concept. It's not like, oh, it's just happened to align perfectly and that just, that's just the burden that they have to bear and carry in their life, when actuality, just a function of how our society is built and the way mental health is viewed and the way the mental health shows up. In classical musicians, according to this study done, it's the most beautiful paper I think I've ever read. I really, really love this paper, and I think it's very accessible, and I think that's why I really love the paper. It's called Music and Madness, and it's exploring the link between musical genius and neuropsychopathy. This whole idea is, do you have to have a mental illness or a mental disorder to be able to be very skilled and talented in music? Because there are a lot of musicians who suffer from mental disorders, and unfortunately it leads them, or society, or whatever the situation is, has led them to an untimely death, right? In classical musicians, according to this study, mood disorders are often described and range between 34.6% and 41%, right? And in at least 1/3 of all of these cases, these symptoms have been clearly responsible for interruption or cessation of their creative work and disruptions of life patterns. Yes, there is a high prevalence of classical musicians who suffer from mental disorder, but that isn't necessarily what propels them to make amazing creative work per se, right? Because actually, in a lot of these cases that are unable to continue with their work because of this mental disorder is damning. Vincent van Gogh, who is often heralded as the example, the pinnacle of this idea of tortured genius, because he suffered with his mental health across his entire life. There are times when he was unable to complete pieces of work or do work that he really wanted to do because he was in a mental hospital, because he was having a mental breakdown, because he was drinking himself into a stupor and he could not even hold a paintbrush. That's not inspiring his genius. That's not propelling him forward or making him a better artist, right? It just means that he was unable to do the work that he really, really wanted to do. I also think that we can't forget the entanglement between fame and art, and because of the way our society is set up. The expectation and pressure that you have once you are assigned this statement of genius, or you're assigned this statement of you're such a great musician, right? If you're told your entire life or your entire musical career that this album that you potentially created in the darkest period of your life is the best you will ever achieve, right? you will subconsciously or maybe even consciously put yourself in that position again and again in hopes of achieving that title that was once ascribed to you before. There have been times when many musicians have come out being like, I am so crippled with this idea of creating something else that is as good as what I had created before that I can't even create. And I think this again goes back to the statement that Kanye West says, like, he doesn't just say that, oh, I can't be on meds and create the music I want to create. He specifically says, I cannot be on meds and create dark fantasy level music. Darkest Fantasy, or my beautiful dark twisted fantasy? Yeah, that album is, by critics, is one of his greatest albums. It's one of his best albums. In fact, it's one of the best rap albums of all time. He wants to aspire to his set level of what he deems as the greatest peak, right? Not what the music he currently wants to create that emulates or encapsulates or reflects the music or his personal experience in his life. He wants to continue pushing the boundaries and being the musical genius that people think and what he thinks he is, because it has become so intrinsic and entangled in his identity. And that can be seen across a multitude of musicians and artists and literary writers who suffer from mental illness. This whole idea of, I need to create something and be amazing. This obsession, this idea of this obsession for greatness to the point where it's crippling.
Female genius.
There's a scene in the Netflix. I'm referencing a lot of Netflix shows today, guys. Okay. This is entirely a Netflix promotion episode. So there's a scene in Never Have I Ever which sticks with me, apart from Paxton's abs. But beyond all of that in the show, there's an episode where Davy, which is our main character, and she goes through ups and downs, and she makes terrible decisions, and she has panic attacks, and she has psychosomatic illnesses, and she goes through it, okay, basically in this entire series. And so she has a therapist, beautiful lady, and she basically says this to Davy. I'm not quoting this, I'm paraphrasing it, but this whole idea of that, Davy, you feel a lot, right? You feel every single emotion to the maximum highs. You feel anger to its extremes. You feel sadness to its extremes. But you also feel happiness to the extremes. You get so excited, you feel so much joy. And while that may be hard in the moments where things are sad and down, it also means that you are going to live a beautifully rich life. I think the greatest art, in my personal opinion, is inspired by life, by the experience of it, by the stories, the rain, the joy, the sadness. The full kaleidoscope of life is what inspires beautiful art. And the most amazing and well-constructed pieces of art that fully express everything an artist wants and to say and do is done, or it can only be done when they are in the headspace to do so. If you can't even pick up a pen to draw, it doesn't matter how many imagination or like how many ideas or thoughts you have flowing around your head and this internal pressure and whatnot, like it doesn't matter. If you cannot bring yourself, or you do not have the mental headspace or the physical headspace even to be able to produce that piece of work, it will forever go and remain unfinished, right? There is no point in torturing yourself to the point where you cannot even produce art, the thing that you are torturing yourself to produce, and that it never even comes to realization. So, example, one of my favorite albums of recent times is Silence Between Songs by Madison Beer. And I think Madison Beer gets a bad rap because, you know, she's gorgeous and she's so pretty and she's so beautiful and she's so amazing, but that's all people know her for. Oh, she's like the pretty girl. But her last album was genuinely amazing. Almost flawless in my opinion, right? And in this album, she fully displays to me how music and lyricism can be used to process a wide range of emotions. She talks about how she had such crippling anxiety that she didn't even see a way forward. And she could only write those songs afterwards, right? Like after she had experienced it, she had been like, okay, this is how I felt about it. Using the music as a propeller for her healing journey allowed her to create, like, there's the most beautiful song. It's called Spinning, is the first song on the album. And she basically talks about how she was in such a bad, anxious phase of her life where to the point where she didn't see an end to the anxiety, constant anxiety that she felt. And it was like as if the world stopped spinning. And so when she kind of came out of that, or she was starting to heal from that, she decided to write that song. And it's one of the most beautiful songs on the album, right? She also has really fun songs where she talks about how much she is loved and how much she wants to love and give to people. She talks about her relationship with her brother and all of the things that she couldn't articulate in words to him, she wanted to put through song. This album is a perfect example of how music and art is used to fully embody and be used to create the kaleidoscope of things that she's experienced in her life. Not just the darkest and the most negative times, but all of those little moments, those little happy moments, those things that make it sound like this beautiful eclipse. Like, the album is just genuinely so gorgeous. Even Van Gogh, who is this pinnacle of the tortured artist, after the birth of his nephew, one of my favorite Van Gogh paintings is like the really beautiful one where it's like blue and it has all of these sweet almond blossoms and it's absolutely gorgeous, and personally one of my favorite. I know everybody references Starry Night as one of his most famous paintings, but this one is personally my favorite, and he drew that after the birth of his nephew. So Van Gogh wrote, "I started right away to make a picture for him to hang in their bedroom, branches of white almond blossom against the blue sky." He created that out of love for his brother, for his nephew, for this new life that is coming into the world, and he wanted to encapsulate that feeling of new birth and brilliance, right? To me, that's my favorite and the most beautiful Van Gogh painting that is done in the phase of his life where he was appreciative of life. Even Van Gogh, in a letter to his brother, said, "In spite of everything, I shall rise again. I will take up my pencil, which I have forsaken in my great discouragement, and I will go on drawing," right? I have forsaken in my great... I feel like I'm breaking down a Dave lyric or Shakespeare. This idea that he forsaken it in his great discouragement, during his depression, during his mental disorders, he was unable to pick up his pencil and draw and make the art that he so wanted to create. In spite of everything, I shall rise again. I want to create brilliant art. This is what I want to do. And I know currently right now, I cannot do it in this mental headspace that I'm in. But one day I will come back and I will continue drawing. And I know that we often think of Van Gogh as the perfect example of somebody who was tortured for his art, but he wasn't tortured for his art. He suffered. He suffered from a medical mental illness, and that was something he had to live with for his entire life. And unfortunately, the help he was getting was not enough. I really think it sullies his work and his memory and his love of the art, of the beauty of the art of it in itself, to say that his art was beautiful because of his mental illness. And in fact, and I think a lot of artists will tell you the same thing, his art was beautiful in spite of his mental illness. It's a romanticization of mental illness, in all honesty. Having a mental illness is unfortunately a part of people. People who have bipolar disorder or depression or anxiety don't want it. It's a part of their existence, and it's something that you have to kind of learn how to accept and to live with and to manage in the correct way. But that doesn't mean that they don't want to use that experience to create something beautiful and encouraging, whether it's a discussion of how it has made them feel, or it's like, I want to be able to turn something into something very beautiful. Again, I think we should look at it in spite of. The tortured artist is an artist that, in spite of being tortured, has decided to create something beautiful. And that, I think, is something we can learn from in every area of your life. If you don't consider yourself a creative or an artist, even though I believe everybody is a creative, but that's a topic for another episode. Even if you don't consider yourself an artist or a creative or anything by any means, sometimes it rains and it pours, and it can rain and rain and rain and rain for days and days and days. But then sometimes, instead of just watching the rain, being like, it's raining, it's raining, it's raining, it's raining, maybe just put a bucket out and catch some water. Do you get what I mean? That's a really bad... It's like, I'm trying to be very philosophical, like, lemons, like, make some lemonade or that kind of stuff. But do you kind of get my point? Like, in spite of everything, in spite of all of the mental torture, artists created something beautiful. So in spite of what you're going through in life, because you will go through a lot in life, life is a kaleidoscope of happiness, sadness, joy, excitement, love, loss, grief. It's everything, right? You can still find ways to create something beautiful in your own way, to think of something beautiful, to make something beautiful. Yeah, I think that is the sentiment that I have learned from exploring the tortured genius in itself.
Female genius.
Sylvia Plath said something that, to me personally, like, really resonates with me right now, just in my phase of life. And she said, what horrifies me most is this idea of being useless, well-educated, brilliantly promising, and fading out into an indifferent middle age. And Sylvia Plath is a very famous writer. She wrote Bell Jar, and she wrote the Unabridged Journals, which is very popular. And if you're on Tumblr, if you're a Tumblr girl, you know Sylvia Plath. You've seen her quotes, you've seen everything. Sylvia Plath suffered with very bad depression to the point where I think in the middle of her life, she unfortunately committed suicide. But that's unfortunately her life experience. But she has created some beautiful pieces of poetry and art. And again, the Bell Jar is heralded as one of a modern literary masterpiece. So to me, it empathies because I basically have been torturing myself of this idea of not living up to my perceived potential and this idea of, oh my God, I can never be as great as people want me to be. And everybody has poured so much, thinks so much of me, and I just can never achieve that. I'm going to have a flipping Cambridge degree and just fade out into like indifference and just live a life where I don't dream of everything and everything's boring and I'm just not happy. Like I'm going to let everybody down. And the weight and the fear of failure, or the fear of not meeting other people's expectations, prevented me from doing anything. Like I would not apply for jobs. I would not apply for like masters. Like I wouldn't do anything like masters, none of it, any of it, because the idea or the fear of it was so stifling and so crippling to the point where I was torturing myself. I would re-record like the past 2 or 3 podcast episodes. So like this past month, I would re-record everything incessantly. And I hated every single episode I had uploaded. Genuinely, like the past 3 or 4 episodes, I despised them. But I just had to be like, you know what? Upload it anyway. I think it's okay to have high standards for yourself. I have extremely high standards of myself. Standards that I don't think I will ever meet, right? The tortured genius and the tortured artist is somebody who, because of society or because of what they deem of themselves, have set themselves such a high precedence. Or again, this is the romanticized view of tortured genius. I'm like, okay, but it doesn't matter as long as they produce their art. But in spite of what, you know, I worked so hard, like my entire degree, to the point where it was like back-breaking work. Like ask any of my friends who witnessed me during that time. I would clock 9, 10, 11, 12 hours a day. I was guzzling 5 cans of Red Bull. Like I poured my whole heart and soul into my degree. And I did all of that. And on my graduation day, I got my diploma. I felt absolutely nothing. And that is partly what inspired this idea of tortured artist and tortured genius. Because I was like, in spite of everybody being like, oh my God, it's so amazing, you got a degree, like you're a genius, I tortured myself for it and it didn't feel worth it at all. And I can imagine if you were to go to Van Gogh or Sylvia Plath or all of these other people, this torture didn't make them happy by any means. Yes, it allowed them to maybe take a peek into different aspects of the human experience that they couldn't have done without, or made them experience emotions or the height of emotions that maybe not normal people can experience, making it easy for them to, like, you could argue so many little details, but the frank reality of it is they just weren't happy. And what is the point of living a life or doing all of these things if by the end, when you achieve that goal, you look on like the scratches on your hand, you look down the front of the mountain, you look down to like the sweat and the ragged of your face, and you're like, wow, this is so worth it. And you're just like, it was all like pointless. And I think that's a very, very good point to learn from the idea of the tortured artist. Like, there's a Bible verse that I think links really well with this, is like, what is it worth to gain the whole world but lose your soul? What is it worth to create the most beautiful piece of art if when you get there, you can't even see the beauty in it?
Female genius.
Yeah. Another thing, if you guys aren't close to me, don't know, please have the One Piece shirt. I have a One Piece shirt. My friend Mish got this for me for my birthday. I'm a massive, massive anime fan. Like, honestly, this should be called the female nerd podcast, nerd podcast, because I am the definition of I'm sitting here talking to you about the research I did about, the research that I did when I was deciding what it means to be a tortured genius, and then I read and I read anime and I like comic books. Like, I'm just like as nerdy as it gets, to be honest. But I really love sports animes. I say I really love. I've watched 4. Haikyuu, Kuroko no Basket, Blue Lock. I watched 3, and then I watched that running one, Prince of Tennis. No, I watched a lot of sports anime. Given the fact that there isn't like loads, I've watched quite a few. But Blue Lock and Haikyuu are my favorite. I think it's an underpinning lesson in animes like Haikyuu or Kuroko no Basket or even Blue Lock itself that I think would be the perfect way to round up the series of genius and achieving genius and what it means, and this idea of torturing yourself to achieve something, right? In Haikyuu or in Blue Lock or in any sports anime that you see, the characters care so much about the sport. The sport is their lifeline, right? The idea that Haikyuu or Hinata can play volleyball, and that's all he wants, that his dream. That's been his dream, it's been his focus, zero-eyed, zero goal, like that's all he wants, right? In Blue Lock, they pull all of these football crazy maniacs, and they're like, look, like, if this is what you want, this is your last opportunity to get it. Because if you flop here, you're never going to play for the Japan team again. So all of these people are like, right, like, I need to give 110% because this is something I desperately want. Like, I love this game. I love this sport. I want to be the best. I want to be on the world stage, and I can see myself being there. That Hinata, Haikyuu, Kuroko no, like all of it, that is the idea, the sentiment that somebody really loves the sport to the point where they feel like they deserve and really want to be there, right? And there are different characters that have different examples. For example, Nagi in Blue Lock, he doesn't really care to be there, but he's really good. In fact, I'm going to do a whole series, and I've been kind of planning it, a series where I like talk about the different animes I've watched, or cartoons or animations or whatever it is, and talk about all of the very cool lessons that are in those animes that I have found. So stay tuned for that. I don't know if I want to make it like a main, like, Female Genius Fridays, like, episode series, or if I want to make it like a footnotes series. So we'll see. I'm currently rewatching Avatar: The Last Airbender, so I think that will probably be the first one up. Anyway. So there's a sentiment echo that if you do not look after your body, in fact, in sports, if you are an athlete, I am not an athlete by any means, but I did play football for like a year. I did netball and I did dance when I was younger. So maybe I am an athlete. Any athlete can tell you that playing a sport is as much a psychological game as it is a physical one, right? And they will tell you this idea of looking after your body and your mind is so fundamental to performing at 110% in a sport, as much as it is training and lifting weights and playing and just being really good in the sport itself. Like, it's so intrinsic. For example, is this a spoiler? I'm going to try and be as vague as possible, but I don't know if it's been animated yet either. Anyway, Haikyuu Vanguard, Hinata is unable to perform as well as he possibly could in this very, very important match, right, in volleyball. He was unable to do that because he wasn't looking after himself. He wasn't eating properly. He wasn't sleeping properly, to the point where he had a fever and he could barely walk. Like, he just couldn't perform. And they were like, we can't, you're not doing, you have to leave. There is the door, like, you can't be on this court anymore. So he has this whole training arc, and training arcs are some of my favorite arcs in anime. Actually, a whole episode on training arcs. Generally, some people ask me, like, how do you come up with ideas for episodes? But ideas come to me in episodes, right? Like, I'll be talking about something, I'll be like, wait, like, I could actually talk about this for another 30 minutes. Anyway, so he has this whole training arc, and in the training arc, he goes to Brazil and he starts learning how to play beach volleyball, which is very, very different from indoor court, like Japanese volleyball. And a very, very important sentiment is when he started looking after his body, you know, he started sleeping 8 hours, he started eating well, he started doing yoga and meditation in the morning. He started playing beach volleyball, and even though he was very terrible at it, he kept going. He was happy. He prioritized his mental health. So when it came to him to come back to Japan and go to the big leagues, he was shining. His balance was on point. His mental health was on point. His focus was on point. He can genuinely give 110% to the game that he loves so much, right? For before, when he was breaking himself down, torturing himself to achieve this level of genius, right? He couldn't even finish the game, right? And that is the sentiment. And what I'm trying to say is that you can't give 110% to your goals if you do not look after yourself, if you torture yourself. Like, take that from me. Like, maybe I would have done better in my degree. Maybe I would have gotten a first if I had slept 8 hours. Maybe I would have gotten a first if I allowed myself to take a year off when my mental health was as bad as possible and allowed myself to recuperate and then come back, you know. I don't like living in babies and what's if and whatnot, right? But I think it's a sentiment that at the end, and as I close off this series, because the last episode I said that what is your genius, what makes you happy, what drives you to do things and to perform well in things. I want to finish off this episode by saying that you cannot show up for your art, for your creativity, for everything if you do not look after yourself. Van Gogh could not paint any more of his paintings because he wasn't in the correct mind phrase. He wasn't looking after himself the way he needed to look after himself. You know, this sentiment is echoed across many things, and it's something that is belabored in sport, but I don't know why the same sentiment isn't put in art. Like, you can work hard, you can sacrifice things, but if you sacrifice your mind and your body to get there, you will not be happy when you get there. You will not be able to achieve it. And even if you don't achieve a goal, knowing that you put 110% into something you really, really wanted can help suffice that I actually did my absolute best. Anyway, guys, I have been yapping for actually genuinely like an hour. I love you guys so much. Thank you so much for tuning in for this little series. I know this was a little bit dark, but it's something I genuinely wanted to explore. And yeah, and then for those of you guys who stuck around and I'm like, Jesi, I don't know if I'm motivated or if I'm depressed because this was a really sad episode. I completely understand. So am I going to regret saying this? Sunday footnotes episode, we're going to have a little fun. We're going to deviate from this idea of genius and we're going to talk about crushes and boys, and I'm going to embarrass myself. So I will see you there. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you later, my little geniuses. Goodbye.